Hello, and welcome to this week's Ask an Atheist. My name is Liz Cavell. I am Associate Counsel for the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Today, we will be asking why American taxpayers are forced to pour their hard-earned dollars into religious schools, even when taxpayers aren't religious themselves or have a different religion than the schools being funded. And as always, we welcome your input. You can put questions in the Facebook comments below, or you can email them to askanatheist@ffrf.org. Joining me remotely today is Senior Counsel Patrick Elliott. Hi, Pat.
Hi, nice to join you.
And here in the studio with me is legal fellow Karen Heineman, her first time on Ask an Atheist. Welcome, Karen.
Hello.
So, Patrick, we're talking about this topic again today, public money going to private religious schools, and apropos of FFRF's recently filed lawsuit. So we just filed a lawsuit in South Carolina that has to do with public money going into religious schools. So can you tell us about the case you just filed?
Yeah, this is a really recent case we filed. It's been less than 2 weeks now that we sued state officials in South Carolina on behalf of some of our FFRF members and as well as a taxpayer in South Carolina over funding that the state approved to go to a religious institution. And the grant that was in the state budget was a $1.5 million grant that was going to go to Christian Learning Centers of Greenville County, which some of our members may be familiar with this, but they basically do release time, provide Bible classes to public school kids, which is what they've done for a very long time there. This was, I think, quite appropriately, some outrage in the local newspapers and people upset that this money would be going to this organization. So we stepped in, we filed suit again just 2 weeks ago. We are, you can see the current headquarters there. The group would like to get this $1.5 million and use it towards building a brand new school complex. I think a $14 million project is what they've proposed, and this is in Greenville County, South Carolina. We have some of our plaintiffs live in this county and are aware of what this group is doing and really oppose, which I think a lot of people should oppose. Our topic today is this money, public money, going to religious schools rather than them doing this with private funds. And so the organization itself, I think Karen can shed a little bit of light on where would this be going. What's the problem here? What's this group? Christian Learning Centers of Greenville County, if you can share some info with our viewers today about what the group is that would be getting the funding.
Yeah, so Christian Learning Centers is a nonprofit organization. It has been established in Greenville County for more than 2 decades, so quite a while, like Patrick said. Its stated mission is to provide biblical instruction to school children, and it does this through a release time educational program. It provides courses that are targeted to middle school and high school students, and this is accomplished by the students are transported away from the public school. They receive these biblical courses, Christian education, and then they are transported back to the public schools. In addition, there's an online version now as well. The high school students can actually receive public school credit for taking these courses, and that is because in 2006, South Carolina passed a law, a Release Time Credit Act, that basically for any accredited courses, such as what Christian Learning Centers is providing through this Release Time educational program, these high school students actually receive credit towards their public high school diploma. So in essence, public school students taken away from public school receive Christian education, get high school credit for it, and go back to the public school. This does require permission by the students' parents. We do have a form, an enrollment form that we're showing you just to really to show you what the titles of the classes are, which is kind of a little interesting. I just scratch my head with Christianity versus cults and religions, what that actually teaches. So this really translates to, again, these public students being taken away from public school during the school day, receiving Christian education, and then receiving public school credit for that. Additionally, Christian Learning Centers encourages their students to spread the word to others, to elect Jesus, to bring Jesus into their lives. And in 2020, they had a plan in Vision 2020 that their goal was to reach and to provide Christian education to all of the middle schools and high schools in Greenville County. So the goal to expand into all schools. So in short, Christian Learning Centers of Greenville County is a private religious nonprofit with a goal of providing evangelical Christian education to students, and it's currently accomplishing this through the release time Christian education courses that it provides.
So, Patrick, so basically we're talking about a ministry, right? It's an evangelical ministry, and the way that they do their evangelism is through public schools. So when we're talking about South Carolina giving $1.5 million to the Christian legal centers, is this just for people that are watching and trying to understand our lawsuits? Is this just in the state budget? It's like a line item, $1.5 million. It's for you, no strings attached. Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, it's in the state budget, but I believe that there are strings attached. That's not necessarily relevant to what our lawsuit complaint says, but they just it's the only thing in the budget is the name of the organization and the $1.5 million. We know independently that this was pitched as forming a school, and why that's a problem. And so this kind of relates to today's topic is we brought a case under two provisions of the South Carolina Constitution. One is, the equivalent of the federal establishment clause, saying that this is establishing religion. But the second one is the more interesting aspect, is they have this provision that says, no money shall be paid from public funds, nor shall the credit of the state or any of its political subdivisions be used for the direct benefit of any religious or other private educational institution. So South Carolina is unique. Some other states have similar provisions, but they want to fund public schools.
Right.
They've made the decision going back many years, and as their constitution has been revised, to not fund private education, to not fund private schools. And so even if they weren't religious, just as a private educational institution, this poses a problem, a constitutional problem that the governor and the legislature so far are approved and are trying to have the money released, and we're trying to stop.
Right. So South Carolina is unique in that its state constitution specifically says that public money shall not go to private schools, period. And that is just a policy decision of the state of South Carolina to really channel its public resources into a robust public school system and not to divert any public taxpayer money to this or that private school, religious or not. And so it's kind of doubly wrong what is being done with this tax giveaway to Christian legal centers, because not only is it going to religious education, which is a problem, separation of church and state problem, it's violating the public policy of South Carolina, which is to keep public taxpayer funds in public schools, South Carolina public schools, and not divert that money to private schools. And $1.5 million is not a small giveaway, probably, when it comes to public school funding, I would imagine.
Yes, and in 2020, the no aid clause in the Constitution was challenged, and the South Carolina Supreme Court ruled that the governor could not spend federal funds that were provided as part of a COVID aid relief for educational purposes. He could not send those to private educational institutions within the state because it violated the no aid clause that we're talking about in their Constitution.
Yeah, so that's really telling, because as recently as 2020, this constitutional principle of no public money to private schools was upheld by the South Carolina highest court of South Carolina. And we talk about this topic a lot on this program and just in general, which is why public money should not be going into private schools, especially religious schools. But the constitutional principle really stems out of these broader principles that were present at the founding of the U.S. And we often point to the Statute for Religious Freedom that was passed in Virginia at the time of the founding, and that we have our little Thomas Jefferson graphic up right now. But it's the strong language in that statute that blocked funding for religion, including seminaries, and it guaranteed, the language up there is that no citizen shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever. And that was really a really strong repudiation of the idea that public money should go to any religious endeavor whatsoever. And that's, you know, what we talk about when we're defending the founding principle of church-state separation.
Yeah, and we've gone from, you know, that principle, which was the precursor to the Federal Establishment Clause, to now what a lot of our viewers know, what we all know, is the courts, the Supreme Court, have increasingly allowed funding to go to religious institutions, despite some of this language. So one of those cases, which Liz and I have previously gone on this program and talked about, is interesting because it kind of gets to today's topic of, you know, why this is a problem. Is, do we really want the government and religious entities to interact in this way, you know, providing religious education? How could that possibly work in a constitutional manner? And so Liz, I know we have an update on one of these cases, the Carson v. Macon case in Maine. There, the Supreme Court ruled that, you know, the government was improperly restricting money to go to some rural schools that would provide education to students if they were religious. So that decision came down this summer, and we already have an update kind of on how the schools are treating this, if you want to share that.
Right. So we've talked about that case on this program. Of course, Carson versus Macon, it was dealt a huge blow to the principle of separation of church and state, because like Patrick said, the Supreme Court basically told the state of Maine, if you are going to pay tuition for rural students to go to private schools, you can't exclude religious schools from those same tuition payments, even if your state constitution requires that's a violation of the free exercise rights of those schools. But what we've seen since the case came down is the state of Maine is insisting, okay, that's all good and well, but still the schools that are going to participate in our tuition reimbursement program for rural students have to abide by the Maine human right law, which means they have to have policies that are compliant with anti-discrimination laws. They can't discriminate on the basis of sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, and of course, and you see this AP headline, the religious schools, including the plaintiff schools in the Carson versus Macon case, don't want to participate in the funding program under those rules. They want to, you know, have their cake and eat it too. They want to operate in violation of the discrimination and the non-discrimination laws in Maine, but they also want to be able to get reimbursed with public money for student tuition, rural student tuition. So like, this is the problem with this principle. It's that, you know, public money, it's bad enough to say that like public money has to go to religious schools, because to exclude religious schools from these, you know, public funding programs is a violation of the religious schools' free exercise rights. But it's really like anathema to both public education and a lot of just American people to say, also your tax dollars have to fund these schools, and they don't have to abide by any of the same types of accountability that you expect for public schools, because of course with public money should come public accountability. Like, we don't want to fund schools that aren't teaching you know, students up to accreditation standards, or aren't complying with the Americans with Disabilities Act in terms of providing facilities for disabled students. Like, we don't want to fund, and likewise, we don't want to fund schools that are able to discriminate in hiring their staff, discriminate on the basis of sex, sexual orientation against students in enrollment and just in their operations. But this is what religious schools are demanding in Maine, and they're already threatening to sue further for not just the right to have public money to operate or to go to their religious schools, but to operate in a discriminatory way, because that is also part of their religious practice or belief.
Yeah, I think you bring up the good point about even with the Americans with Disabilities Act, because we've talked about this before as discrimination. I think people always view that as, oh, do we have to admit all students, including students, on the basis of sexual orientation? But what currently law for religious schools, and this has gone to the Supreme Court a number of times, is for employees. There have been employees who had a disability and were fired from their Catholic school, and the U.S. Supreme Court said that was okay because they were functioning as ministers of the school. Therefore, it was inappropriate for courts to delve into who can and who cannot be a minister. So the framework, I think, we're kind of trying to look at this from a little bit of a broader view, is there are things that religious schools do that they do not want state involvement in, including like who can be the teachers, what maybe some of their qualifications may be. And then there is the counter interests of citizens of states saying, hey, we think this is wrong, right? We don't think you should be fired because you have a disability and that I have to pay the school money for it. So I think that you're, kind of bringing up some of these ancillary laws and things highlights the problem is the religious institutions want full independence and want to do whatever they want. But then when they want the public money, then we have this conflict of can they still get public money and do whatever they want? That's what they're arguing for. And I think that's the problem in the first place with funding religious schools, is they're always going to want that. They're always going to want to do what their religion says and not necessarily follow our secular laws.
Right. I mean, it's bad enough that, and of course, this Supreme Court takes an ever-expanding view of the free exercise rights of religious employers and religious schools and religious litigants, but it's really already like enough of a blow to our secular laws that most religious actors are exempt from all kinds of laws that bind other people acting in a space. So like Patrick's describing, religious employers already don't have to abide by the same types of laws that other employers, your employer, my employer, has to abide by in terms of why they can fire people, on what basis they can hire people, what type of things they can demand of their employees, right? Religious actors are already really broadly exempt from some of these protections, and it's not enough. They want that exemption and independence and also public money to fund their operations. And it's just at what point do taxpayers have a say, a majority of taxpayers have a say in what our money is funding and, who has to play by the rules.
Yeah, and one of the points when we usually bring this up in the context of, why there is public control over public schools. We all live in places that have publicly elected school boards. So there's the idea that schools are responsive to the local community. Even for those people who don't have children in the school system, they have some interest and some say in what they're funding and how those schools are operating. And what I've always kind of thought of, just because, FFRF is based out of Wisconsin and the Milwaukee voucher program is one of the longest running voucher programs in the country. So that's providing funding to go to overwhelmingly religious schools in the city, which is legal according to the Wisconsin Supreme Court and the federal courts. But one of the bothersome things are some of the policy that you see when that has happened. And so we've looked at a few examples of that. And some of the worst examples are basically schools operating without any controls that you would see in any public school anywhere. And so one of those schools, for example, is Life Skills Academy. This school no longer exists, thankfully, in Wisconsin. But it was a participant in the National School Lunch Program, so it had to serve meals that were compliant. And this is a report from the state, talking about allegations against the school, saying that they were serving ramen noodles with hot sauce and a cup of water for lunch, that they had cut whole milk with water, that it had repeated issues with bats, that they served moldy apple juice. I mean, this is a basic thing of, can you feed children a healthy meal and that also be compliant with the meal guidelines in order to get that to be funded through the state. And this was a school that was operating in Milwaukee. It was run by a pastor. After some of these issues arose and after the state started to try to shut down its funding, it closed up shop in the middle of the night in December, and I don't know if it was 2015 or 2014, just closed up shop and left the families scrambling to find a new place to educate their kids. So that's one example of this is the type of thing that people would be outraged and would go to their school board and make changes and have people fired, but these guys could just leave. And by the way, they moved to Florida and set up another school. So this is the kind of bothersome aspects when there's not really a public element of control over a religious school. The other thing, and I've kind of agreed with people who've pointed this out about some of the pop-up schools in Milwaukee, is there's this question, or there was an article asking, do kids deserve playgrounds? You'd be hard-pressed to find any public school of elementary school kids that doesn't have a playground or a safe place for kids to play. This is an image of a school. This was taken a number of years ago in Milwaukee. Is this an appropriate thing for the public to be funding? This is a place. Some schools didn't even have an outdoor space to play, which seems like a pretty basic and fundamental aspect. Even our men and women who are in prisons have a outdoor recreation area. So I'm bothered by the policy aspect. Isn't just I have no control over what these schools are doing, but as a former Wisconsin taxpayer, we're paying for it, and I think people have a right to have some say in it. And so that kind of goes to that accountability question I think you brought up, Liz, is there's really a lack of accountability for religious schools because they are operating without that public control element.
Right. And in a minute, I'm going to check and see if we have any questions from viewers, but just to kind of bring it full circle, when we're talking about the $1.5 million kind of line item giveaway to Christian legal centers in South Carolina, it's kind of a similar thing, right? There's no suggestion of any accountability whatsoever tied to that funding, right? It's just going to be used for a school for this religious, sectarian ministry organization. And it's a boatload of South Carolina taxpayer money just going to a religious group with no accountability. So I think rightly South Carolina taxpayers are sort of horrified at that, and our plaintiffs included are not going to stand for it, especially when it clearly violates the principles, the public school, the commitment principles laid out in the South Carolina Constitution. So let's see if we have any questions here. Okay, here's an interesting one. Patrick, this one is about the Carson v. Macon case. So in the case from Maine, is the case for Maine going to open the floodgates of public funds to private schools, or was the ruling narrow enough that it won't be widespread in effect? And if it has opened a floodgate, is there any way to fight back?
Yeah, I mean, you both should probably share your opinions on this too. It was narrow in the sense of it says, states don't have to create programs like this. Like they're not.
Uh-oh, Patrick froze.
Include religion. But,
You froze.
Am I back?
You're back.
Okay. Basically, I don't think states are required to go down that road of funding schools that way. But if they do have a program that funds, private schools, it seems likely, yes, that they would have to include religious schools in those programs. So I don't know if you want to answer kind of the larger, where's this going? I don't know the answer.
I mean, the other thing that was narrow in a sense in the Maine case is just the circumstances of how Maine funds private schools is very unique, because Maine has a really high number of counties that have so few secondary school students that they do not have a public school in the county. And that is what has caused the state of Maine to develop this system for paying tuition for those students to go to private schools of their choice often, or to attend another public school that's out of the county. So that situation doesn't really present itself in many other places. I don't know. We don't know of other states that have a system of funding secondary school tuition for individual students. But the whole point of that is it's meant to replace, provide students with a public education. But since there's no school in that person's county, they're trying to approximate a public education elsewhere in the state. What is widespread and floodgates opening about the main case is it's just a further kind of, it takes a further sledgehammer to the idea that the constitutional principle that public funding should not go to religious schools, and just kind of cracks that open even wider. And like we talked about when we were talking about the fallout from the Maine decision, it really kind of paves the way for further pushing of the envelope in cases that are going to come up inevitably after the Macon decision that press the court to say, not only is it our free exercise right to get the funding, it's our free exercise right to discriminate and, you know, do all the things we want to do in line with our religious beliefs and still take the public funding. And that is where I think you're going to see inevitably litigation pressing further and further on the question of, you know, how expansive are free exercise rights and how just obliterated is the separation of church and state when it comes to funding religious schools. So we have one more, oh, no, we have a couple more questions. So here's one. This one's a little saucy, but I'll just throw it out there. There are a lot of things taxpayers may not like, but still have to pay for. Why is religion different?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. You know, and this actually kind of even goes back to, there were some challenges during the Vietnam War era about people paying their income taxes and whether they could be forced to do so. The difference here is this is based in a constitutional principle, and in South Carolina specifically, and in other states, their state version of a no aid provision. So this is based in the Constitution that funding cannot go for that purpose. So that gives you a legal right that can be enforced, and that's including all individuals. I think the idea that people don't always like what the government funds is just a duh. Yes, we all think that, right? I don't think anybody thinks, oh, everything I fund, and can I withhold or can I do that? But I mean, maybe to be fair to this question, we're talking about this in the sense of taxpayers, and I think maybe that's why people think how money is spent. But the larger principle is a little bit more religious preference is inevitable if the government starts funding religious institutions. And so I highly doubt that the state of South Carolina is going to be funding Muslim schools or a Satanist educational institution. This is really tied to the government wanting to promote and be identified with particular religions. And so I think that also differentiates it a little bit, where we've kind of agreed as a society, we don't think the government should be in the business of religion. The government is in the business of a lot of other things, and taxpayers may not like maybe sometimes where that money flows, but it doesn't have the same kind of constitutional underpinning. That's how I would phrase it. I don't know if either of you have a different take.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the religion is different because we have a foundational principle of our nation, and I mean, I think there's like a broader philosophical, political question about whether some people want this to be the case or not. But it is the case that our nation was founded on, like, a foundational principle of our nation and our Constitution is that our government does not take a position on questions of religion. Our government is religiously neutral, which means it should not be in any way using the power of the purse to play favorites with different religions or to even prop up religions or whatever. It's not just a question of like taxpayers don't like it, which we are talking about the policy implications of taxpayer money funding odious things as we're talking about this. But the more foundational question is that, constitutionally, our government doesn't support religion. That's a founding principle of our nation. That's different than the myriad other things that you might disagree, we may or may not disagree with our tax dollars being used for. So I think that's important to remember. And some people, think that that's the end of the discussion. Like America, like that constitutional principle is not that important to me. And so I don't care about, I think religion is just the same as parks and roads when it comes to what my tax dollars should fund. But that is a un-American, way of looking at our foundation, our constitutional foundation. So like it or not. Karen, anything to add?
No, I think one thing I would say is that the concern about the no aid clauses, there was a case that just in one of the district courts in Michigan yesterday upheld a similar no aid clause to the one that we're looking at in the South Carolina Constitution. So hopefully, again, when you don't allow public funds to go to any type of private educational institution, religious or otherwise, hopefully that line will hold even after Carson v. Macon.
Yes, right. I don't understand this question, but I will read it. People often say we should tax the churches. I don't ever see that happening, but if they would, wouldn't that only allow more tax money, into private religious schools? I don't know how to think about that question, but I love taxing churches and wish that we would do it.
Yeah, and I do see this. I mean, and maybe our this is where our viewers are at too. If you see on Twitter anybody talks about it, it's a very popular position. I also agree with the sentiment of, I guess if it was you, Liz, or our questioner, that it's unlikely that that's going to happen. I think that there's so much inertia. I mean, we see this all the time because we've been successful sometimes getting churches taxed in terms of the properties that they own that they're not using. I've done that a number of times. But there's so much inertia, and the churches are just indignant. How could I be forced to pay a tax? And it's like, well, that's what everybody else does. We've created a tax code, though, over however many years since the income tax was even issued, that nonprofits and churches were kind of given this exemption. I think, we all work for a nonprofit, that us and other groups would say, hey, fine, let's just treat everybody the same and tax income that comes into churches or other nonprofits, and that money then can be used for public services or our public schools. So maybe that's what they're getting at is, hey, if they're taxed, there's more money, they're a bigger pot of money, and maybe that money would be allocated in that way. So I think it's a very popular position, but probably not realistic to think that there's political will by people in office to change the tax rules on churches.
Yeah, I think the question maybe is getting at this sense of not only is it not in keeping with our constitutional, foundations, it's also kind of unfair because you don't even pay into the public coffers and you are trying to get public money, in the face of flying in the face of our Constitution and our First Amendment. So it's getting at that unfairness of at least if churches were taxed, it would seem more fair if public money were to flow to religious organizations or religious actors. But I think what we all have such a hard time with at FFRF, because again, we work for a 501c3 and we avail ourselves of many tax exemptions that are available to nonprofits. But again, even in that space, there is favored treatment for religious actors and organizations because, tax exemption is a privilege, not a right. And for the privilege of tax exemption, there's a lot of, again, accountability and transparency, financial transparency that goes with it, including auditing, tax auditing forms, tax forms that you fill out to maintain your tax exempt status, and churches are exempt from all of that. So again, it's there's a lot short of taxing churches. There's a lot more accountability and kind of buy-in that we could demand of religious organizations. But again, the political will and the tradition, because we're coming from a tradition of separation between religion and government, and that's where a lot of this you're exempt from all these rules and accountability measures comes from. It's like, we're not even going to look into your books or anything like that because it's separate. And that's our constitutional mandate. But of course they want that, but they want it where they want it, and they don't want it when it comes to public funding. So that's where the problems arise.
Yeah, it gets back to what we're seeing even in our court cases, that they want all of the benefits, any public benefits, but none of the burdens. So I think maybe that's the simplest way that this question is getting at. And we've pointed out in briefs to courts that that's what's going on, is that they want maybe not the government to be involved in something, but they also want all the public money or all of the benefits that might flow to any other institution. So that's the larger theme, I think, that's going on with this country. And maybe that's why people are supporting of, hey, maybe churches should be taxed, because they're participating in all these other endeavors, but they're not paying in at all.
Right. Well, I don't know what's happening here. So that's the last question I have, because I can't get the next question. Yeah, sorry, last questioner, I can't get the last question. But that's going to conclude Ask an Atheist for this week. Thank you so much for joining us. Be sure to check out FFRF's broadcast TV program. It's Free Thought Matters. This week's guest is Sam Perry, co-author of the new book, The Flag and the Cross. Here's a preview.
Broadly understood, white Christian nationalism, I think, is an ideology that places religious rhetoric and feeling behind this perception that America rightfully belongs to people like us. And when I say people like us, I mean white, ethnically, if not racially, traditional or conservative, Christian or even pro-Christian. Like, you actually don't necessarily need to identify as a Christian to really embrace white Christian nationalism. It just is almost an ethnic category at that point. But these are Americans who believe the country belongs to. It was founded by people like us. It belongs to people like us. And we need to take back our country for people like us.
You can watch Free Thought Matters on TV stations around the U.S. on Sunday mornings or on FFRF's YouTube and Facebook channels. Also, check out Free Thought Radio, FFRF's weekly radio show and podcast. And to find out where to hear Free Thought Radio, visit ffrf.org/radio. If you want more information about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, check out our website at ffrf.org. We will see you next time on FFRF's Ask an Atheist.
Freedom!